Hi there, and welcome to episode 4 of our Dissemination Day. For this episode, Hannah and I are going to be doing it as a pair, so it's going to be a bit different. And how we've decided to do this, I think, to try and keep it natural, is that Hannah has read the paper and I have not read the paper. So Hannah is going to describe the paper to me and I will ask questions as I think of them. Some of them might not be that sensible. So the title for today's paper is...
Reduction of Restraint of People with Intellectual Disabilities, an Organisational Behaviour Management Approach. It was published in the Research and Developmental Disabilities Journal back in 2011, and it's by Don E. Williams and Deborah L. Grosset.
Okay, so I guess we should start with what's the background to this paper? Like what's it in general about?
So the background of the paper was that the authors felt there was an awful lot of research around other approaches to reducing restraint. And therefore, they wanted to look in more detail or produce more evidence around an OBM or Organisational Behaviour Management Approach to restraint reduction.
Yeah. So. And I guess yesterday you and I, as people who quite openly say, that OBM is not our specialist area necessarily. Like, we've been doing some learning about it, but been to a couple of workshops and conferences, but definitely not something that I've been engaging with for a long time.
Yes.
This research is a republication, isn't it?
It's a republication of a chapter that appeared in a book in 1984 by the first author of this article. So it's quite an old piece of research that's being republished. But I think still one that's relevant and useful to an extent in this day.
Because I was quite surprised. This is my naivety, but I was quite surprised that OBM was being published about back in 1984.
Yes, and we looked it up last night, didn't we? Around actually it was from the 70s.
Yeah,
that OBM first sort of came into being. So
that was something new for me to learn. So tell me what the 6 points are about restraint reduction.
So the authors point out in this article that there have been publications that have looked at 5 particular different areas in relation to restraint reduction. The first being restraint fading, the second being looking at staff training around reducing levels of restraint. The third being the assessment and modification of antecedents, so antecedent-based interventions. The fourth being around the modification of the criteria for releasing somebody during a restraint, and the fifth being around sort of a vague one really, around actually implementing successful treatment and actually what that looks like.
And
they've not elaborated.
Explain what that means? Presumably they mean things like treating mental health conditions or is that what they're referring to? Or do they explain
it's not detailed in the article, so I guess that's sort of...
I think because we prepped yesterday and we talked about what we were going to talk about, I think I'm going to say this a lot.
Yeah.
That
go on then.
Although we really loved the topic of this article and I got quite excited about it and I thought OBM, that's awesome, and restraint reduction, that's our thing. People might disagree with me, but I found it really hard to be just totally clear on what this article was describing and what it was that they actually did.
I think it's missing the bones.
Yes.
There's the basic outline there, but it's the details aren't there. It's not replicable in terms of being a piece of research.
So I think initially we wanted to give the authors the benefit of the doubt for this, because sometimes the publishing journals can be quite strict in terms of how many words you're allowed to use for an article. So I did, because I'm slightly silly that way, go and check what the word count was for this particular journal, and they definitely weren't anywhere near the maximum amount. So I do feel a little bit disappointed, I think, in this might come across in some of the discussions, that actually I would have loved, because I would have loved to just know more. And maybe I feel a bit cheated from some of that information. Yeah,
because as you'll see, sort of the outcomes and results are actually relatively impressive. It would be nice to see exactly how they came to achieve that, much more detail around specifics. Yeah.
So the 6th point, which they are saying is the new point, the one that wasn't already being done in a broad sense, or in lots of other areas, was
the wider organisational implementation. So the OBM approach to restraint reduction. So yes, they're arguing that this article provides evidence of the benefit of an OBM approach to restraint reduction.
Yes. So just to summarise,
Mm-hmm.
they are republishing work that they did in 1984 that was part of a book chapter. They've kind of set it in the context of saying there were these 5 areas that everybody was already kind of looking at in terms of restraint reduction, and they're adding this novel area of organisational approaches to restraint reduction.
Yeah, and they're saying, we did this, it seemed to work, here's some evidence.
Cool. Okay. So, in terms of the setting, this is like mind-blowing, right?
Yeah.
So, tell me about the setting.
So the setting was a setting described as a large state facility. By large, we mean extremely, exceptionally large.
Like nebulous.
Nebulously huge. Enormous, even probably by 80s standards, I'd say. A residential service with 925 people.
Which is just insane. Like, I thought you had made a mistake when you told me that at first. I cannot.
An age range of 13 to 65. And a range of different intellectual disabilities, mild to profound intellectual disabilities, and broken up into 6 individual units.
Just massive.
Yes.
It's huge.
Yes.
And actually, I suppose that is something that's really encouraging, is that they've managed to, when you go on to describe the results, people see this, but achieving positive outcomes, I think, in a what is essentially must have been an institution, but you know, in a facility that size,
yes,
is just like gobsmacking. Wow. Okay. So, who were the participants targeted in this study?
So the first stage of the research, the researchers carried out a facility-wide assessment of all the individuals that lived there, and they focused on individuals who engaged in episodes of physical aggression towards others, and also who engaged in self-injurious behaviour, particularly those that caused injury to themselves, who had mechanical reactive measures in place, so reactive strategies that involved mechanical restraint. They focused specifically on mechanical restraint alone.
Yeah. And we were quite surprised by this, because actually mechanical restraint, in my experience, is just not it's just not very widespread in terms of usage. I can only think of one person ever I've encountered actually who has had the use of a mechanical restraint. Unless, I suppose, you count helmets for head banging. But again, even still, very few.
They don't specify the forms of mechanical restraint that are used either. So
we're not clear if it's arm splints or belts.
Bearing in mind the decade in which the research is occurring, it could be some quite sort of significant.
And we did think that maybe it was much more widely used in the 80s.
Absolutely.
Potentially. Yeah. So that's it. That's interesting.
Yeah.
How many people?
That is not specified.
Yeah, this made me upset.
I know.
Like, I really wanted to know how many, because
me too.
Like all 925, or like what percentage? Is it one person?
You not, but that does, I think, affect the validity of the results.
Yeah,
to be honest.
It seems like a fairly standard thing that you would have. So, what did they how did they choose a group? Did they define?
So the group that were defined as engaging in those behaviours and had the use of mechanical restraints were defined as a priority group within the service, and they received the intervention.
Yeah. So we think it's not everybody, because they refer to a priority group.
Yeah.
But we don't know how many it is.
No.
Okay. I guess we move on now to what they did. So describe to me what they did.
So every individual identified as being part of the priority group received a behaviour intervention plan that was developed by the psychologist. They talk about development, implementation and evaluation as being part of that. Again, that's not specified. They talk about the fact that these behavioural interventions were evaluated monthly, and that data was collected and tracked, that there were clear objectives, but again, none of these are specified within the article.
Yeah.
They also talk about implementing organisational contingencies, so the focus on the OBM approach, the organisational contingencies being implemented.
And again, this was a point where I was like, I really want to know what
this
that
is
means.
the OBM bit.
Yeah, tell me about it. Like, how do I do that bit?
Yeah, so there's, again, not a great deal of information around exactly what that looked like. They talk about the fact that everybody who engaged in these behaviours and who received the use of mechanical restraint, part of this priority group, had to have a behavioural intervention plan. That therefore, in response to that, psychologists were given positive feedback for when they complied, and described as corrective feedback when it wasn't implemented. But again, what positive feedback or corrective feedback look like, where they come from, not specified.
But that is a positive thing,
yes.
because that feeds into kind of BST, and I can see how that would work. Yeah. I guess the bit that we talked about last night was that actually, in terms of the dimensions of ABA,
yes,
and research within ABA, I'm not sure that I would be able to go and implement that procedure.
Yeah, the technological.
I don't think it would be replicable. Exactly.
Yeah, it's not replicable.
Yeah, I don't think it would be well, not for me.
No.
So that made me a bit sad, because I would have liked to know. I really would have liked to know that.
Yeah.
Okay. So what was the dependent variable? Specifically, the number of uses of mechanical restraint? Or?
It's as simple as that. The number of uses of mechanical restraint in this priority group.
And is it reported as rate, or is it reported as...
This is reported as a percentage reduction, so an 80% reduction over the course of 17 months.
Yeah, which is amazing.
It is amazing, but it's 80% of what?
Yes.
I think is the question, percentages, and don't necessarily tell us the whole story.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think from what I was looking at, they did only have one baseline point.
Yes.
And I suppose that's the number over a month. So maybe fair enough. Maybe it's fairly standard. But was that a particularly high month?
Was it a bad month?
A bad month.
Were things happening? Was it Christmas?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
So I do think that from a research perspective, unfortunately, although this I think we should be delighted that there was an 80% reduction. It's difficult to tell precisely whether or not that trend is purely because of the correlation, increased number of BIPs, and the OBM approach.
Yeah, and whether there were any compounding variables, and that they logged it alongside the implementation of the behaviour intervention plans on their graph, as you can see now.
Yeah. So they did report 1 point in favour of their results, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. They also, alongside the use of mechanical restraints, they tracked the number of injuries that have been reported, just to see whether the use of mechanical restraint was being reduced, but injuries were going to go up as a result. And actually they found that the number of injuries was staying the same, it was stable. So mechanical restraint was going down, but injuries were staying at the same rate rather than increasing.
And for mechanical restraint, I think that injuries would be the thing that you would want, if you're looking at self-injury.
One of the primary reasons why you'd use something that restrictive. Yeah.
But then what they didn't do, and this was my kind of obvious point, was they didn't report if other forms of restraint had remained stable. Absolutely.
So mechanical restraint might have gone down by 80%, but there might have been a huge increase in the
physical
use of
restraint.
Physical. It might be that people are just being held rather than being restrained mechanically.
Whatever that looks like.
Yeah.
So maybe I'm being overly critical, but I couldn't figure out why they wouldn't report that. I'm guessing even in the 80s they would have had to record it. Yeah. Maybe they didn't. Maybe there was no requirement for them to take that data, so they couldn't put their hands on it easily. But I couldn't figure out a little bit why they wouldn't tell us that.
No, absolutely. And that would have been really valuable to have had that information.
Yeah.
In terms of actually seeing whether this OBM approach was having a positive impact on people's quality of life. Yeah. At the end of the day.
So in terms of discussion, I think we've probably, it's a really short article, so maybe the discussion warranted is maybe more limited, but we've touched on some of these points. We raised the issue about replicability.
Yep.
And it's not a JABA article, so maybe that's something that wasn't flagged. but I would have liked more information.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the chapter's not in press, is it, anymore? So
no,
we can't go and find it.
No, we did look into that.
Because we did look into that.
Absolutely. The authors point out, sort of in terms of outcomes related to this research, they're saying it to support the use of organisational goals, having development of a plan, and then the monthly reviews all contributed to that reduction in that particular use of restrictive intervention.
Mm-hmm.
And they focus quite a bit upon the importance of having adequately trained psychologists who've got an understanding of behaviour. So,
did they assess the quality of the BIPs in any way?
That's another point which links into my last dissemination day, which focused upon actually the drastic difference between a low quality behaviour support plan and a high quality behaviour support plan, and what effect that can have. And no, there wasn't any evaluation done of the quality of those. Yeah.
And they didn't presumably either monitor procedural fidelity.
No, it mentions implementation. It mentions evaluation, but it doesn't specifically state how they monitored the procedural fidelity.
Yeah. Okay. So there are some really, I think, without wanting to be overly critical, because for every dissemination day until now, we've been like, woohoo, we love this article.
Yeah.
And I do really like what they've tried to do in this article,
and the
what
points
they have
making
done in this article. But I think in terms of the geeky part of my brain that loves the research side of things is a bit confused about how they got there.
And I suppose I'm sort of thinking, why wouldn't that work? It more than likely would have an impact. We talk an awful lot, don't we, about this top-down approach within organisations to implementing PBS and having every level of the organisation on board.
Very much back to episode 1 where they were talking about big management support, big senior.
Does this article support that case effectively?
Good question. And I think it's important. It's important to be critical of research. There's a lot of information out there, and I think for many people, if it's in a journal article, then it's gospel. And they've never really been encouraged. Particularly people that aren't maybe academically inclined, have never really been encouraged to pick it apart and to try and understand what really went on and to try and understand the influence of variables. And that's when some slightly mad alternative interventions, and I'm not saying there aren't other good interventions, but like some of the ones we know not to be good, that's probably how some of them gained momentum. Yes. Yeah. So I think in conclusion, overall, we would say, that we enjoyed reading it. Well, you enjoyed reading it. I enjoyed questioning you about it.
Oh yeah, I enjoyed being questioned.
And that we love what they tried to do. And actually, I really hope that there is more OBM research out there of this nature, specifically focusing on restraint reduction, because this could be huge. It could be such a useful tool for practitioners. I just don't think they could copy this one.
No, they really couldn't. No. Which is a shame.
That is a shame. Yes. All right. So I guess we'll leave it there.
That's us for another week.
That is us for another week, and it brings us to the end of our first month of dissemination days. And actually, we're all really thrilled and thankful that so many people have got in touch to say that they're enjoying it, which is quite.
And we're having fun.
And we're having fun. Yeah. And I feel like I've learned, which is good.
Yep.
So next month, as Paddy gave the game away, we are going to be focusing on practice leadership. We might be changing the schedule of the sessions a little bit. More information to come on that. Please do let us know if you disagree with us on any of this. And
comment, share your thoughts.
And in the meantime, see you next time.